It's a great way to start our day because, as I mentioned, the point of this is to give you actionable items to take back to your workplaces. One of the organizations that has been at the forefront of all of the technologies that you just heard about is the United States military. The military recognized the possibilities of all of these technologies early on, and of course the threats that they are facing are some of the most difficult and challenging threats in the entire world. And so it is appropriate that we hear from the military today as part of our conversation. It's a delight for me to welcome Major General William Hicks of Army Futures Command to gain some insights into how the military is using these technologies and planning to move forward. General, thanks very much for joining me this morning.
Nice to meet you, Francis.
You too, sir. Thanks very much for coming. Have a seat. Every interview that I've done with your colleagues in the military over the past several months since the release of the National Defense Strategy, one word continues to permeate throughout it, and that's lethality. And I'm not sure that most people who aren't in our space would draw a logical connection between IT modernization and lethality, but it's there. And I wonder if we could start there in our conversation, thinking about the concepts of the National Defense Strategy and what your mission is at Futures Command.
Sure. So first off, I'd like to step back from that for 1 second and just offer a brief comment about this time in our history. We are facing over the coming decades, and I found it interesting, the transition of AI from narrow to broad to general in the previous presentation. A convergence, an unhappy convergence of geostrategic trends and technology trends that I would say are as profound as those we saw at the turn of the 20th century as nations, we're just past the 100th anniversary of World War I, as nations entered into what was, actually it still is, one of the most lethal wars in the history of mankind, between World War I and World War II, which was a carryover from it, wiped out more than 10% of the global population. I mean, stop and think about that. That's a staggering impact in a relatively short period of time in both cases. These trends include a resurgent Russia, who is playing a bad hand well, and is making some, and has made strategic investments, both in conventional military capabilities we're all familiar with, as well as leading edge technologies. They are still one of the leaders in mathematical computation, so AI is a focus for them, hypersonics, and things like that. They do have some limitations in their technology space. Electromagnetic warfare is a huge area of investment for them and is characterized as their third offset against Western militaries. We also face, and this is the difference between the Cold War and today, a second great power, a rising China. And I think that they will characterize the strategic competition for the 21st century. They too are making huge investments in other areas of technology, in part because they are the bench, if you will, for the development of the global economic IT economy right now, making huge investments, and they have strategic plans in AI and biology and other things leading out to 2050 today, and their military benefits from that. They have also transitioned from a nation focused on their region over the last several years with a number of pronouncements from Chairman Xi Jinping to a global oriented power who have extended their interests into Europe, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Africa with the declaration of the Belt Road System, with the pursuit of moderate prosperity for all Chinese by the middle of the 2030s, a modern military by 2035, and the first-class military. That would suggest that somebody is now second class. First-class military by 2050. And all of that on the military side is in pursuit of a mission that he gave the People's Liberation Army to defend the developmental interests of China, which now extend beyond Asia. So this is a very fundamentally different strategic environment than we have been in, certainly since the end of the Cold War. Those trends converge with many of the technology trends that the previous speaker just went through, so I won't belabor those, other than to say, I think that the transition from broad to general AI will result in a fundamental shift in the world. Toffler talks about waves, the agricultural wave, the industrial wave, the information wave, and I think we're now headlong into the fourth wave of autonomy, with general AI being the full realization of the power of this wave of change. The convergence of those two technological and strategic challenges will color our nation's interests for the rest of this century, and we better get on with it now. So with that,
yes,
lethality. We have been pursuing the power of network forces since the early 1990s, when General Sullivan, one of our previous chiefs of staff, said, harness the electron. And we did this because we recognized that network forces generate more power, more combat power, more capability than those who are disconnected and operating independently and not aware of what everybody else is doing. And we have found over the decades that this initial inclination by General Sullivan was absolutely the case. And on one of the slides at the end of the presentation that preceded me, there was a Stryker combat vehicle. And they are one of the manifestations of our networking effort. And those units are the most digitized units in the U.S. Army. They are the most agile, and they fight and function fundamentally differently than every other organization in the Army. And we're all trying to catch up to them in that regard. So the IT revolution is fundamental to the combat output of the Army, and our adversaries' perception of that output, our competitive advantage, is fundamental to preventing war, which is our first job, is to prevent war, to deter others from doing untoward things towards the United States and our allies.
You mentioned the great power competition in which we're engaged right now, General. Mm-hmm. One of the differences between the structure in which you operate in the United States military and the structure in which our adversaries operate is that there are protections and procedures and protocols in place for good reasons in a society such as ours. Mm-hmm. Procurement and acquisition and economic and so on, that our adversaries don't have to abide by because of the structures of their political systems and their economies. Is it possible to make some of those challenges from a strategic perspective work in our favor, or at least to turn those disadvantages neutral?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we already do. I was at a conference talking about the Chinese military a couple of months ago, and I was asked a similar question. Given their 2050 strategies and all of the investment that many high-tech companies have made in China, and the fact that they manufacture a great deal of the IT used around the world, if we were at risk. And I think we have to recognize that it's a challenge and that they are serious-minded about what they intend to achieve, as are the Russians, and not dismiss them as, we won the Cold War and look backward. We have to look forward. But I believe that their systems, their political and economic systems, effectively create a ceiling that they can't get through, and that we, because of the dynamic nature of our society and our political and economic system, we always reward entrepreneurs and innovators in ways that they will not be able to match. Now, they're trying. And as I say, we have to be very sober-minded about the efforts that they've undertaken, not only in their national strategies, particularly the Chinese, but also in their economic approaches in major companies like Alibaba and their pursuit of being able to manufacture the chips that we're seeing the negotiations with ZTE on right now. They want to be able to do that at home for obvious reasons. The good news is we're in front of them, and we just have to make sure we stay there.
Mm-hmm. One of my big takeaways from Dr. Kelly's presentation a moment ago is kind of the vision that we can see on the landscape. What specifically is the vision that you see on the landscape technologically that the work that you're doing in IT modernization will do? How will that manifest itself to the warfighter at some point in the future? You can choose whatever point on the horizon you'd like.
Well, I'll talk in two points. So we are moving very aggressively to exploit the leading edge of development today. Cloud computing in particular, and instantiation of narrow AI, and as broad AI becomes increasingly available, we'll look to exploit that as well. And you see that in a host of areas, from pilot assist capabilities in helicopters to tools that we give to soldiers. And then the larger network, we have 6 priorities for modernization, and one of them is the network, and it's not just the network that goes into our command and control headquarters. It's down to the soldier, and from the soldier to our autonomous systems as well. So that is a critical focus today, and we're also working to leverage synthetic training, modeling, augmented and virtual reality capabilities to raise the game of our soldiers and leaders in ways that we have not been able to do in the past. Not to use science fiction, but I think a good analogy is Ender's Game. Some of you may be familiar with it or saw the movie, which I thought was a terrible representation of the book. But anybody here? The idea is that the immersion in a virtual environment gives the average leader the sets and reps to raise their game in ways that we have not been able to do because of the expense of live training. You always want to do the live training. That's kind of your graduation exercise. But if you can raise the level of competence and familiarity of leaders and their units in the virtual space before you go live, you get a far better outcome at the end of the day. Our very best units train live all the time. Our Tier 1 combat counter-terrorist forces. But they also have ammunition accounts that we usually associate with corps, which are several 100,000 people. We can't do that for every platoon and squad in the Army. So that is one area. The other opportunity, which is more on the horizon, and I think the buzzword today is edge computing. But I think I'll get this term wrong, so I'm going to look it up here, because I have seen these in action. Yeah, neuromorphic chips. I think that's the next big thing in that area, because to do all the things I just talked about, you have to have a resilient network. And I mentioned that the Russians look at electromagnetic warfare as their offset against us. I would tell you the Chinese are actually, they're post-doctoral. The Russians are doctoral. The Chinese are post-doctoral in the EW space. Command and control warfare is a fundamental aspect of how they see the fight. So that's quite a challenge in that very, lethal is the right word, but very tough environment to communicate and maintain network connectivity. I think that these neuromorphic chips, effectively putting the brain back on board at the lowest possible level, be it a robot or a information device on a soldier, or some of the larger command and control systems that may be used by leaders above the individual soldier level, will go a long way in reducing our dependency on constant connectivity and having to reach back into the cloud for constant operation. So I think that's the next big thing. It's not today, but I'm very excited about what I have seen, both from, I think IBM has True North, and then HRL has a similar capability that I've seen demonstrated for DARPA.
With all of these technologies on the landscape and with the enthusiasm that you have for them, again from a strategic perspective or a conceptual perspective, how do you keep folks in the Army focused on capabilities that are required to maintain an edge on the adversary to deter war, and keep them away from the concept of this is a new tool and we want to find a terrific use for it because it's powerful?
Well, the good news is historically, this is true of all militaries, not just the U.S. Army, we have been bad at exploiting opportunities, but we are great at solving problems. So the challenge is to be focused on the threat. The last big transformation of the U.S. Army was in the 70s. We came out of Vietnam. There's some interesting parallels here. We came out of Vietnam, at that time the longest war in our history. Woke up to the Soviet Union, who had modernized in the 1960s. And then we had the wake-up call of the 73 Arab-Israeli War, which at that time was a harbinger of what the future battlefield could look like. That provided a laser focus for the Army to modernize itself. And I think they did a pretty good job, because we're still living off the fat, so to speak, of the foresight of great leaders like Creighton Abrams, hero of World War II, and General Depew and General Story. General Story was the father of airland battle, which was kind of our intellectual signpost for that period, and really is an intellectual foundation for how we think about fighting today. And that's an important piece. Technology without a purpose, without a focus on a problem, is interesting, and you're right, you can spend a lot of time chasing shiny objects and get nowhere. So you have to have an intellectual concept that complements and provides an integrated approach to how you leverage and exploit and eventually apply technology to solve problems. I mentioned we have done a bad job of this in the past. The Quartermaster General of the Army in the Civil War was not interested in repeating arms because it was very expensive to buy more bullets, just as an example. But we're not the only ones. In World War I, everybody had the same bright, shiny objects: machine guns, long-range artillery, poison gas, etc. None of them had the intellectual framework on what they should be used for, how to fight with them, and how to win with them. And of course, there was stalemate. And again, millions of people died because of that intellectual gap in our thinking. And then, not to pick on my French colleagues, but in the early days of World War II, they had a defensive concept. They had the best technology in Europe, and they were defeated by a better idea, what we call blitzkrieg, the Germans call it lively war, in the invasion of France. Mm-hmm. And so you have to have both pieces, and that's a great way to discipline things. But you have to stay focused on the problem.
So the theme there that I take away from all of those observations is that maybe the most important thread, more so than the technology, is the strategic applications and the importance of maintaining the concept of technology as an enabler of capability rather than vice versa. And I think sometimes maybe that's where we all kind of get sucked in.
No, that's right. Technology by itself is not a panacea. Ownership is not 9/10 of the law in war. You have to have that happy complement of intellect, intellectual framework, well-trained, well-led troops, and you want the best technology. Desert Storm is a great example of that, where we had well-trained, well-led units, and at that time we had the best technology in the world, and that war was over in 4 days. And frankly, that fight, 28 days if you count the air campaign, that fight was a wake-up call for both, at that time, the Soviet Union and the Chinese. So the changes that I mentioned earlier really emanate from their looking at that fight and going, okay, we're not ready for this. And then they spent a decade getting an intellectual framework. The Russians spent a decade transforming their army, and the Chinese have done the same thing, starting with their Navy and Air Force, and now their ground force. So we should give them something else to recognize that they're not ready for.
Do we need to use IT modernization in the Army and more broadly in the military as the impetus for a transformation, as you talked about happened in the 70s? Or can it be maybe a little more sequential or evolutionary than some broad-based transformation?
Well, I think it's both. There are tremendous opportunities that we can leverage in pursuing problems that we have to solve today that the larger IT capabilities will give us. Some new, waveforms and communications capabilities, increasingly powerful chips, the instantiation of AI, and leveraging cloud computing will all help us in getting more out of the Army we have, and then bringing in new capabilities, particularly the leading edge of autonomy. But as I mentioned, particularly with the projection of general AI by about 2050, that convergence I talked about earlier, we have to keep an eye on that at the same time. So we have to think in time and solve the problems of today and keep an eye on the future at the same time.
We just have a minute or two left, General. I'm grateful for your time. What are the big rocks that you're trying to move today and that you would like to move in the immediate, not too distant future?
We have 6 modernization priorities, and they run from long-range fires through a next-generation combat vehicle, a future vertical lift platform, the network, air and missile defense, and then soldier lethality. In each of those, the network is a fundamental enabling capability in all cases. You can't shoot far if you can't see and network those sensors back into your launch platforms and the guidance systems on the munitions that you're shooting. So being able to shoot far is important, but being able to see and network is fundamental. Likewise, the next generation combat vehicle will be a teamed manned, unmanned capability, and being able to network those autonomous systems into a manned platform, and then hopefully, as I say, leverage those brain on board capabilities downstream will fundamentally change how we operate there. Future vertical lift, we're going to be moving much faster and have greater stationing time, and that will have, but again, if you're move fast and you're far out, you got to be able to network back and stay connected, et cetera. So that cascades through. One thing I would point out is we have a number of Defense Department priorities, which I think are hugely important. And I know the new R&E has emphasized hypervelocity systems, hypersonics, and directed energy, and the Army is very much in favor of those. But the other area, and again, I think IT capabilities will help with this in managing them, ballistically resilient lightweight material. Lots of people make structurally strong lightweight materials, but nobody in commercial industry needs to be able to take a bullet. We do. So that's an area where I think computing power and things like Watson may be able to aid us in making some breakthroughs there. Power and energy is another area because it's going to be a much faster, more lethal battlefield, and so we're going to have to not fight as grouped together as we used to be. We'll have to be dispersed. It's very difficult to do when you have platforms that consume massive amounts of fuel and things like that. So there are some other areas that we'll need help with.
General Hicks, we could do probably the rest of the program talking about those, but we're out of time, and we're very grateful
No, I
that you were able
appreciate
to
your
join
time
us this morning.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.